She wandered lost in the shadows, until a path of light showed her the way back to hope. Maggie had always considered herself a strong person. Life wasn't always easy, but she prided herself on navigating challenges with grace and determination. At least she did until the year everything fell apart. It started with her husband, Dan, a kind, steadfast man who had been her rock for more than 20 years. Their life together wasn't grand or extraordinary, but it was rich with love and filled with the simple joys they both cherished. A steaming cup of coffee shared in the quiet of dawn, the way Dan hummed old country songs while fixing things around the house, and their Sunday walks by the lake. All of it built a world Maggie felt blessed to call her own. But life doesn't always honor the worlds we carefully build. One sunny morning, while Maggie was at work, Dan suffered a massive heart attack. By the time she reached the hospital, it was too late. Just like that, her other half was gone, and with him, the future they had dreamed of together. The weeks after Dan's death were a blur. Friends and family tried to comfort her, but their well-meaning words couldn't reach the hollow space inside her chest. The house felt like a tomb, too quiet and too full of memories. Maggie found herself wandering aimlessly from room to room, clutching Dan's old flannel shirt or staring at photos of the life they had shared. Every corner of her home was a reminder of what she had lost. And then, just as she thought she couldn't feel more broken, the world delivered another blow. Maggie had worked at the same company for years, a stable job that helped her and Dan make ends meet. But a round of corporate layoffs meant that Maggie was suddenly unemployed, with no safety net to fall back on. The small savings they had built over the years were already stretched thin by funeral expenses. Now, with no income and no immediate prospects, Maggie's despair deepened. Day after day, Maggie sat in her darkened living room, staring at nothing. Friends stopped calling as often, unsure of how to help her. She felt herself retreating further and further into a shell of grief and isolation. Nights were the worst. Alone in the quiet, she would lay awake, replaying the moment she got the call about Dan over and over in her mind. What if I'd been home? She'd think. Could I have saved him? The guilt and sorrow were unrelenting, and they wrapped around her like a heavy fog, pulling her down. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, Maggie decided to leave the house. She didn't have a destination in mind. She just needed to move to escape the suffocating weight pressing on her chest. She grabbed her coat, slipped on her shoes, and stepped into the chilly night air. The streets of her small town were quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after everyone has settled into their homes for the evening. Streetlights cast pale circles of light onto the pavement, but beyond their glow, the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly. Maggie walked without purpose, her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. The cold air stung her cheeks, but she welcomed the sharp sensation. At least it was something she could feel. As she wandered, Maggie's mind churned with questions that had no answers. Why did this happen? She whispered to herself. Why now? Why us? The silence of the night offered no response. Her feet carried her toward the edge of town, where the paved roads gave way to a narrow dirt path that led into the woods. It was a path she and Dan had walked countless times during their Sunday outings. She hesitated for a moment at the entrance, the dark canopy of trees ahead both familiar and foreboding. Then, without really thinking about it, she stepped onto the path. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Maggie walked slowly, her steps crunching softly on the gravel beneath her. The trees stretched high above, their branches forming a latticework against the star-speckled sky. It should have been peaceful, but Maggie felt only the gnawing ache of loneliness. She didn't know how long she walked. Time seemed to slip away in the shadows, and the path ahead looked the same as the path behind. For the first time, a flicker of unease crept into her thoughts. She stopped and turned, realizing she couldn't see the lights of the town anymore. The woods felt darker, the shadows deeper. Maggie's breath quickened as she fought a rising sense of panic. "I shouldn't have come here," she muttered, turning back toward the direction she thought she had come from. But the path looked unfamiliar now, and each step seemed to lead her further into the darkness. The tall trees loomed around her, their silhouettes like sentinels guarding secrets she didn't want to uncover. Maggie's panic grew. Tears welled in her eyes as she stumbled forward, unsure of where she was going. "Help," she whispered into the night, her voice barely audible. "Please, someone help me." And then she saw it, a faint light in the distance, glowing softly through the trees. At first, she thought it might be the light of a house or a car, but as she drew closer, she realized it was something else entirely. The light was pale and ethereal, shifting gently like a flame, but without a source she could see. It seemed to float, suspended in the air, and it beckoned her forward with an unspoken invitation. Maggie's fear began to ebb, replaced by a strange sense of calm. She didn't understand why, but she felt compelled to follow the light. It was as though it was guiding her, drawing her away from the shadows and back towards something she couldn't yet name. With tentative steps, she moved toward it, her heart beating fast but steady. The chapter closes with Maggie stepping into the light, her face bathed in its glow. The woods around her seem less dark now, and though she doesn't yet know where the light is leading her, she feels, for the first time in a long time, the faintest flicker of hope. Maggie followed the light, its soft glow drawing her deeper into the woods. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, otherworldly yet calming, like a beacon meant just for her. Each step seemed to quiet the storm raging within her chest, replacing fear with a strange, inexplicable sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that erased her sorrow, but one that whispered there was something more beyond it, if only she kept walking. As she moved closer, the light began to shift and shimmer, forming into a delicate pattern that seemed almost intentional. Maggie paused, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a shape she could name, but it carried a kind of symmetry that made it feel alive. She tilted her head, watching the light with cautious curiosity, and then she saw her, just beyond the glow. A woman stood in the shadows, cloaked in white. Her form seemed both solid and ethereal, as though she were part of the light itself. Her features were soft, with kind eyes that held a depth Maggie couldn't quite fathom. She didn't speak, but her presence carried an undeniable sense of warmth and reassurance. Maggie froze, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. "Hello!" Maggie's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. She didn't expect an answer, and for a moment, none came. The woman simply stood there, her gaze steady, her expression serene. Then, slowly, she raised a hand and gestured for Maggie to follow. The gesture was simple yet compelling, as though it carried an unspoken promise of safety. Maggie hesitated, her instincts warring with her curiosity. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? But as she stared into those calm, knowing eyes, the fear that had gripped her began to dissolve. She didn't know why, but she trusted this stranger in a way that defied logic. Something about her felt familiar. Maggie took a tentative step forward, and the woman turned, gliding ahead as though she moved with the breeze itself. The light surrounded her, casting a gentle glow that illuminated the path. Maggie followed, her steps slow and deliberate, her heart pounding in her chest. The woods that had seemed so dark and oppressive moments ago now felt transformed. The shadows still lingered, but they no longer seemed threatening. Instead, they felt like part of the journey, a contrast that made the light even more profound. As they walked, Maggie noticed the world around her seemed to come alive in subtle, unexpected ways. The trees, which had loomed so menacingly before, now seemed to stretch protectively overhead, their branches forming a canopy of intricate patterns. The air was cool but not biting, carrying with it the faintest scent of earth and pine. Even the distant rustle of leaves sounded like a melody, gentle and rhythmic. Maggie's thoughts began to wander as she followed the woman. She thought of Dan, of his laugh, his smile, the way he used to hold her hand when they walked this very path. A pang of longing surged within her, sharp and sudden, but it didn't overwhelm her the way it usually did. Instead, it softened into something bittersweet, a reminder of the love they had shared rather than the loss that had torn them apart. The woman ahead paused, turning slightly as if to ensure Maggie was still following. Maggie met her gaze, and in that moment, she felt as though the woman could see everything: her pain, her guilt, her fear, and even the faint glimmers of hope she had tried to bury. But there was no judgment in those eyes, only understanding. It was as though the woman were telling her, without words, that she didn't have to carry it all alone. They continued walking, and the light around the woman seemed to shift again, growing brighter and more dynamic. Maggie realized it wasn't just a light. It was alive, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. The realization filled her with awe. What was this? Who was this? Who are you? Maggie finally asked, her voice trembling. Why are you helping me? The woman didn't answer, at least not with words. Instead, she extended her hand toward Maggie. For a moment, Maggie hesitated. The gesture was simple, but it carried weight, as though accepting it would mean opening herself up to something she didn't fully understand. But the longer she stood there, the more she realized she didn't want to turn back. She didn't want to return to the darkness and despair that had consumed her life. She wanted to believe there was something more, something worth reaching for. With a deep breath, Maggie stepped forward and placed her hand in the woman's. The warmth that radiated from her touch was unlike anything Maggie had ever felt. It wasn't just physical warmth. It was emotional, spiritual, a kind of reassurance that seemed to fill every corner of her being. Tears sprang to Maggie's eyes, unbidden, and she let them fall. For the first time in months, she didn't feel ashamed of her grief. She didn't feel weak. She just felt human. The woman smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to say, "It's okay. You're not alone." Then, without letting go of Maggie's hand, she began to lead her further down the path. The light around them grew stronger, illuminating the way forward with a clarity that was both literal and symbolic. Maggie felt lighter with each step, as though some invisible weight were being lifted from her shoulders. Eventually, they reached a small clearing where the trees opened up to reveal the night sky. The stars above were brighter than Maggie had ever seen them, twinkling like 1,000 tiny beacons of hope. The woman released Maggie's hand and gestured for her to look up. Maggie tilted her head back, her breath catching at the sight. The stars seemed to stretch endlessly, a reminder of just how vast and infinite the universe was. And yet, standing there in that clearing, she didn't feel insignificant. She felt connected to the stars, to the earth beneath her feet, and to the woman who had guided her there. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Maggie allowed herself to hope. She didn't know what the future held or how she would find her way, but she knew she wasn't walking alone anymore. The woman in white had shown her that much. When Maggie turned back to thank her, the woman was gone. The light had faded, leaving only the glow of the stars above. But Maggie didn't feel abandoned. She felt guided. Whatever the woman's presence had meant, Maggie knew it wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. As Maggie stood in the clearing, her heart still racing from the strange and beautiful encounter. The world around her seemed to change. The soft glow of the stars above remained, but a new light began to shimmer in the air. It was faint at first, like a firefly's flicker in the distance, but it quickly grew brighter. Soon, more lights joined it, appearing all around her like tiny glowing orbs floating just above the ground. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. The lights weren't just random. They moved with purpose, weaving gently through the trees and gathering in a slow, swirling dance around her. Each orb pulsed softly, as if alive, and their glow bathed the clearing in a warm, golden hue. It was beautiful, but there was something more to it, something familiar. One of the orbs floated closer, stopping just in front of Maggie. She reached out instinctively, her hand trembling as she moved it toward the light. The moment her fingers brushed against it, a vision exploded before her eyes. It wasn't like a memory flashing in her mind. It was vivid, tangible, like she was reliving it. She was sitting on a picnic blanket by the lake, the sunlight warming her skin. Dan was beside her, laughing as he tried to balance a plate of sandwiches and 2 cups of lemonade. Maggie could hear the soft rustle of the breeze through the trees and feel the grass tickling her bare feet. It was a perfect summer day, one she had forgotten amidst the haze of her grief. The memory was so vivid that she could almost smell the faint citrus of the lemonade and hear Dan's voice as he teased her about her terrible folding skills when packing up the blanket. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision faded, and Maggie was back in the clearing. The orb drifted away, its glow dimming slightly as it joined the others. Maggie stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't just a memory. It was a reminder of the joy she and Dan had shared, a joy she had buried under the weight of her sorrow. Another orb floated forward, and Maggie reached for it without hesitation. This time, the memory was of a snowy evening. She and Dan were huddled together by the fire, their hands wrapped around steaming mugs of cocoa. The room was quiet except for the crackle of the flames and the occasional creak of the old rocking chair Dan insisted on keeping. She remembered how they had spent hours that night talking about nothing and everything, the way they always did when the world outside seemed to pause. As the second vision faded, Maggie's heart ached, but not in the way it had before. This ache wasn't from loss, it was from gratitude. She realized she had been so consumed by the pain of Dan's absence that she had forgotten how full her life had been because of him. The love they had shared, the memories they had created, those weren't gone. They were still a part of her, waiting to be remembered and cherished. The lights around her began to move more quickly now, swirling in intricate patterns. Maggie reached out again, this time eager to see what the next memory would reveal. One by one, the orbs offered her glimpses of her life. Moments she had cherished, moments she had overlooked, and even moments she hadn't realized were as precious as they truly were. There was the time she and Dan had gotten caught in a sudden downpour during one of their Sunday walks. They had laughed until their sides hurt, drenched from head to toe, but too happy to care. There was the memory of Dan teaching her how to dance in their tiny living room, the furniture pushed against the walls to make space for their clumsy steps. And there was the night they had stayed up late, sitting on the porch and counting shooting stars, their hands intertwined. Each memory was like a gift, a piece of her heart being returned to her. Maggie felt herself changing with every vision. The heaviness that had weighed her down for so long began to lift, replaced by a quiet, steady strength. She realized she wasn't just seeing the past, she was reclaiming it. These moments, these memories, were proof of a life well lived and a love that was real. They weren't gone. They were part of her story, a story that hadn't ended with Dan's passing. As the final orb approached, Maggie hesitated. This one felt different. Its glow was softer, almost hesitant. She reached out, her fingers brushing against its surface, and the memory unfolded slowly. She was standing in a hospital room, holding Dan's hand. The machines around them beeped softly, their sounds a stark contrast to the stillness in the room. Dan's face was pale, his breath shallow, but his eyes were clear as he looked at her. "I love you, Maggie," he had said, his voice weak but steady. "Promise me you'll keep living. Don't let this stop you. You've got so much more to do." The words hit her like a wave. In that moment, Maggie realized she had been holding on to her grief not just because she missed Dan, but because she had forgotten the promise she made to him. He had trusted her to keep going, to find joy again, even without him. And she had let him down until now. The memory faded, and Maggie sank to her knees, her tears falling freely. But these tears weren't just for her loss. They were for her healing. For the first time, she understood that moving forward didn't mean letting go of Dan or forgetting him. It meant honoring him by living the way he would have wanted her to, fully, bravely, and with an open heart. The orbs around her began to fade, their light dimming as they slowly disappeared into the night. But Maggie didn't feel sad to see them go. They had given her exactly what she needed, a way to remember, to heal, and to hope. As the clearing grew quiet once more, Maggie stood, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She looked up at the stars, their light steady and constant, and whispered, "Thank you." She didn't know if the words were for the woman in white, the mysterious orbs, or Dan himself. Maybe they were for all of them. Maggie turned back toward the path, ready to find her way home. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she believed she could face it. Maggie stepped back onto the forest path, her heart still swelling with the emotions stirred by the glowing orbs and the memories they had brought to life. The air felt different now, lighter, almost electric, as though the woods themselves were alive with the energy of something greater than she could comprehend. Each step felt purposeful, even though she didn't know where the path would lead. The moonlight filtered through the branches above, casting soft silver patterns on the ground. Maggie was no longer afraid of the shadows. She understood now that the darkness wasn't meant to frighten her. It was part of the journey, a reminder of the contrast that made the light so much brighter. The path curved gently ahead, and as Maggie rounded the bend, she saw her again, the woman in white. She stood bathed in a soft, unearthly glow, her presence as serene and commanding as before. This time, however, Maggie didn't feel the hesitation she had felt earlier. She walked forward with quiet confidence, her gaze meeting the woman's. "Thank you," Maggie said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "For the memories, for everything." The woman smiled, a gesture so tender it seemed to fill the air with warmth. She didn't speak at first, but her eyes held Maggie's with an intensity that was both comforting and profound. When she finally spoke, her voice was like music, soft, melodic, and resonating with a wisdom beyond words. "You carry much in your heart," the woman said, her tone neither pitying nor admonishing, but simply understanding. "Grief, love, guilt, hope, all of it is part of your journey." Maggie nodded, her throat tight. "I didn't think I could keep going," she admitted. I thought I'd lost everything." The woman stepped closer, her light growing brighter as she spoke. "You haven't lost everything, Maggie. What you shared with him, love, joy, the memories of a life well lived, those are not gone. They live in you. They always will." The words struck Maggie deeply, and she felt the tears welling up again. "But it hurts," she whispered. "Even with the memories, it hurts so much." The woman reached out, her hand hovering just above Maggie's heart. Though she didn't touch her, Maggie felt a wave of warmth, as though the light itself was wrapping around her. "The pain you feel is the love you carry," the woman said. "It's a sign of how deeply you loved and were loved in return. And though the pain may never disappear completely, it will change. In time, it will become a reminder of the beauty of what you had, rather than the emptiness of what you've lost." Maggie closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. For months, she had fought against the pain, trying to push it away or bury it deep inside. But now she realized she didn't have to fight it. She could honor it, accept it, and let it guide her toward healing. "Why are you helping me?" Maggie asked after a moment. "Who are you?" The woman smiled again, and this time, her light seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat. "I am here because you needed me," she said simply. "And I am here because you are not alone. You never have been." The word sent a shiver down Maggie's spine, but it wasn't a shiver of fear. It was the kind of shiver that comes when you feel the truth of something deep in your soul. She thought back to the moments in the past months when she had felt utterly abandoned, as though the world had forgotten her. But standing here now, she realized that maybe she hadn't been as alone as she thought. Maybe there had been unseen forces guiding her, nudging her toward this moment. "What am I supposed to do now?" Maggie asked, her voice trembling. "I've spent so long feeling lost. I don't know how to move forward." The woman's expression softened, and she took Maggie's hand in hers. "Moving forward doesn't mean leaving the past behind," she said. "It means carrying it with you in a way that gives you strength, not sorrow. Dan wanted you to keep living, to find joy again. And there is still so much light waiting for you, Maggie, if you are willing to look for it." Maggie felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. It wasn't loud or overwhelming. It was quiet, like the first rays of dawn breaking through the darkness. But it was there, and it was real. "Will it ever stop hurting?" Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's eyes glistened, and her voice was gentle but firm. "The hurt may soften, but it is part of your love, and love never truly fades. What will change is the way you carry it. It will become a source of strength, a reminder of the beauty you shared and the resilience you have within you." Maggie nodded, the tears streaming down her face now not just from sorrow, but from a sense of release. She felt as though a weight she had been carrying for so long was finally beginning to lift. The woman released Maggie's hand and stepped back slightly. Her glow began to intensify, filling the clearing with light so radiant it seemed to touch everything around them. The trees, the ground, even the air itself seemed to shimmer with life. "You are stronger than you know," the woman said, her voice carrying an almost ethereal quality now. "And you are never alone. Trust the light within you, Maggie. It will guide you, even when the path feels uncertain." Before Maggie could respond, the woman's light grew so bright that Maggie had to shield her eyes. When she looked again, the woman was gone. The clearing was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight once more. Maggie stood there for a long moment, letting the stillness wash over her. She didn't feel abandoned or afraid. Instead, she felt empowered. The woman's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she believed them. She wasn't alone. She had her memories, her love, and the strength to keep going. As Maggie turned back toward the path, she noticed something glimmering on the ground where the woman had stood. It was a small feather, impossibly white and glowing faintly in the moonlight. She picked it up, holding it gently in her hand, and smiled. "I'll try," she whispered, her voice carrying a newfound determination. "I'll keep going." With the feather tucked safely in her pocket and her heart lighter than it had been in months, Maggie began to walk. The path ahead was still uncertain, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had hope, and that was enough. Maggie stepped back onto the familiar dirt path, the glowing feather still tucked safely in her pocket. The forest around her seemed less imposing now, the shadows less heavy. The woman's words echoed in her mind like a melody she didn't want to forget. You are never alone. Trust the light within you. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Maggie believed those words. As she walked, the memories brought to her by the glowing orbs lingered in her thoughts. Each one felt like a small treasure, a piece of her heart she had been too afraid to touch, but was now beginning to reclaim. She thought of Dan's laugh, his steady presence, and the way he always seemed to know exactly how to make her feel safe. But instead of the overwhelming sadness that had once accompanied those thoughts, she felt something different: gratitude. She had been loved deeply, and that love was still a part of her, shaping who she was. The path widened as Maggie emerged from the woods, the small town lights twinkling in the distance. She stood there for a moment, looking out at the world she had once felt disconnected from. It all seemed different now, not in the way it looked, but in the way it felt. She wasn't sure if the change was in the world or in herself, but she realized it didn't matter. What mattered was that she felt ready to take a step forward, even if she didn't know exactly what lay ahead. In the days that followed, Maggie began to make small but significant changes. She started by going through Dan's belongings, something she had avoided for months. At first, the task felt impossible. Each item she touched seemed to carry a weight of its own. A favorite shirt, an old book with his handwritten notes in the margins, the watch he had worn every day. But as she worked, she found that each item also brought back memories, good memories that reminded her of the life they had shared. She decided to keep the things that felt most meaningful, items that made her smile rather than ache. The rest she carefully packed into boxes, donating them to a local charity. It wasn't about letting go of Dan. It was about making space for the life she was beginning to rebuild. One morning, as Maggie was sorting through a box of old photos, she came across an envelope with her name written on it in Dan's handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a letter he had written shortly after his diagnosis but never given her. The words brought fresh tears to her eyes, but they also filled her heart with an indescribable warmth. Maggie, it read, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. I want you to know how much I loved you, how much I still love you. You were my anchor, my safe place, and my greatest joy. But, my love, you need to keep living. Promise me you'll keep finding beauty in the world, even when it feels impossible. You're stronger than you know, and when it's your time to join me, I'll be waiting for you. Until then, live the way you always have, with your whole heart. Maggie clutched the letter to her chest, her tears falling freely. She could almost hear Dan's voice in her mind, steady and sure. His words didn't erase the pain, but they gave her permission to embrace life again, not as a betrayal of his memory, but as a way of honoring it. Motivated by Dan's letter and the mysterious encounter in the woods, Maggie decided it was time to rejoin the world. She started volunteering at a local community center, helping to organize a grief support group. At first, she wasn't sure she was ready. How could she offer support to others when she was still healing herself? But as she sat in that first meeting, listening to others share their stories of loss, she realized she wasn't alone in her pain. There was something profoundly comforting about being surrounded by people who understood, and it gave her the courage to share her own story. The group became a lifeline for Maggie, a place where she could speak freely about her journey and hear the wisdom and strength of others. She found herself forming connections she hadn't expected, friendships that reminded her of the beauty of human connection. Each meeting left her feeling a little lighter, a little stronger. One evening, after a particularly moving session, Maggie stayed behind to help clean up. An older man from the group, Henry, approached her. He had lost his wife years earlier, but had continued attending the group as a way of supporting others. "You have a gift, Maggie," Henry said, his voice kind and steady. "The way you talk about Dan, about the light you found after such darkness, it gives people hope. That's a rare thing." Maggie smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile she hadn't felt in months. "I don't know if I'm giving anyone hope," she said. I just I just want people to know they're not alone." "And that," Henry replied, "is exactly what hope is." His words stayed with Maggie as she left the center that evening. She thought of the woman in white and the light that had guided her through the woods. She thought of the memories brought to life by the orbs and the warmth she had felt in the clearing. She realized that what she had experienced wasn't just about her healing. It was about sharing that healing with others. Over time, Maggie began to feel a sense of purpose returning to her life. She still missed Dan every day, but the pain had softened into something she could carry without it overwhelming her. She found joy in small things: a kind word from a stranger, the laughter of children playing in the park, the vibrant colors of a sunset. Each moment felt like a reminder that life, even in its imperfection, was worth embracing. One day, while walking by the lake, Maggie noticed a single white feather drifting gently in the breeze. She reached out and caught it, holding it in her hand as she smiled. She didn't know if it was a sign, but she didn't need to. It was enough to remind her of the light she had found and the journey she was still on. Maggie continued to volunteer, to share her story, and to live each day with as much love and hope as she could muster. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't walking it alone. Months had passed since Maggie's encounter in the woods, and life had taken on a rhythm that, while not the same as before, felt meaningful in its own way. The heaviness that had once consumed her had softened, replaced by a quiet determination to live with purpose. The woman in white, the glowing orbs, and the memories they had rekindled were never far from her thoughts. They were like a secret source of strength, guiding her in ways she couldn't quite explain. On a crisp autumn morning, Maggie decided to visit a local antique store she hadn't been to in years. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, but something about the day, the crispness of the air, the golden light filtering through the trees, made her feel like exploring. She pulled on a sweater and made her way into town, the leaves crunching underfoot as she walked. The store was just as she remembered it: cozy, cluttered, and filled with the soft scent of aged wood and lavender. Maggie wandered through the aisles, her fingers grazing over worn books, vintage picture frames, and old clocks. She wasn't sure what she was searching for, but she felt drawn to the far corner of the shop, where a collection of paintings and prints was displayed. As she sifted through the stack, her hand froze on one particular canvas. The painting depicted a woman cloaked in white, her figure illuminated by a soft, glowing light. Around her, tiny orbs of light floated, their soft glow almost lifelike. The scene was set in a forest clearing, the trees framing the woman as she extended her hand toward the viewer. The title, written in delicate script at the bottom of the frame, read, "Whispers in the Shadows." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. The painting was almost identical to the scene she had experienced in the woods. The woman's serene expression, the shimmering lights, even the feeling of warmth and peace. It was all there, captured in delicate strokes of paint. She ran her fingers lightly over the frame, her heart pounding in her chest. How was this possible? How could someone else have painted something so specific, so personal? "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said, startling Maggie. She turned to see the shop's owner, a kind-looking woman with gray hair and a warm smile. "Yes," Maggie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It's incredible. Do you know anything about it?" The woman nodded, her eyes softening. "It was painted by a local artist many years ago. She claimed it was inspired by a vision she had during a difficult time in her life. She never said much more about it, but she believed the painting had a way of finding the people who needed it most. Maggie's hand tightened around the frame as she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. It was as though the painting had been waiting for her, a reminder that her experience in the woods wasn't just a fleeting moment of solace. It was part of something much larger, something she was still unraveling. "I'll take it," Maggie said, her voice steady. The shop owner smiled and carefully wrapped the painting, handing it to Maggie as though passing along a precious gift. When Maggie got home, she hung the painting in her living room, positioning it where the morning sunlight would illuminate it each day. She found herself sitting in front of it often, gazing at the woman's outstretched hand and the glowing lights. The painting wasn't just a reminder of what she had experienced. It was a source of comfort, a quiet reassurance that she was on the right path. Inspired by the painting, Maggie began journaling about her journey, writing down the memories the orbs had brought back to her and the lessons she had learned from the woman in white. At first, the words came slowly, but soon the pages began to fill with reflections on grief, love, and the surprising ways hope can find us. She wrote about Dan and the promise she had made to him, about the support group she had joined, and about the small, meaningful moments that had begun to reshape her days. One evening, as she reread her entries, Maggie had an idea. She decided to share her story with the grief support group. It wasn't an easy decision. Her encounter in the woods felt deeply personal, almost sacred, but she felt a nudge, as though the woman in white were silently encouraging her. Maybe her story could help someone else who was struggling to find their way. At the next meeting, Maggie took a deep breath and began to speak. She described the woods, the orbs of light, and the memories they had shown her. She spoke about the woman in white and the way her presence had filled her with a sense of peace and purpose. As she spoke, the room grew quiet, the other group members listening intently. When Maggie finished, there was a long pause before one of the group members, a young woman named Erin, spoke up. "I lost my mom last year," Erin said, her voice trembling. "I've been so afraid that I'll forget her, that the memories will fade. But hearing your story, it makes me feel like maybe those memories aren't gone. Maybe they're just waiting for me to find them again." Maggie's heart swelled with gratitude. Sharing her story hadn't just been about her own healing. It had been about offering hope to others, just as the woman in white had done for her. Over the weeks that followed, Maggie continued to share her story, both with the support group and beyond. She wrote articles for local newsletters, spoke at community events, and even started a small blog where she chronicled her journey. To her surprise, people began reaching out, sharing their own stories of loss and the ways they had found light in the darkness. Each story was unique, but they all carried the same thread of resilience, connection, and hope. One quiet evening, as Maggie sat in her living room, she noticed the painting glowing softly in the fading sunlight. She smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. The journey she had started that night in the woods was far from over, but she no longer felt lost. She had found her way back to herself, to the love she had shared with Dan, and to a purpose that gave her life meaning. As she sat there, a single white feather drifted through the open window, landing gently on the floor beside her. Maggie picked it up, holding it in her hand as a familiar warmth filled the room. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with emotion. She didn't know if the words were meant for Dan, the woman in white, or the universe itself. Maybe they were meant for all of them. And in that moment, Maggie knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.